Good morning, everyone. Mr. I Hate Modern Cartoons is back, and this time we're gonna talk about Infinity Train, which was decent. This was a very conflicting series I'd been meaning to watch since 2016. But at the time, I had nothing but high hopes and thought this was going to be obviously a phenomenal show once it came out. But then years later, I felt less confident about that simply because what I valued from cartoons at the time do not necessarily carry with me the same gravity as of today. But even then, I had no reason to believe this wasn't going to be at the very least a worthwhile watch, especially when it was being distributed as a miniseries, a format that I somewhat approve a bit more than the typical 26 plus episodes per season. So I ended up watching it, and although I liked it, I couldn't help but feel disappointed in a few areas. For starters, let's talk about the art. So I guess the most noteworthy thing was the fact that they changed the character design for the main character, and I think I like this one more simply because the other one from the pilot looked too goofy, which wouldn't necessarily be a problem if it wasn't for the fact that Tulip is for the most part the source of drama in the series, and I think I would take those scenes less seriously if she looked like this. I would say that I liked most of the character designs, not even just among the reoccurring cast. Even one-off characters like those shadow police officers looked memorable in their own right. Now of course the human characters were by far the least remarkable, but that's not a huge deal, mostly because they're not really all that important aside from the main character, who I do think has a memorable design, though it could just be because I've been exposed to her for years and for a lot longer than the rest of the cast. Where the artwork starts to lose me is in the background. Now some of the locations can be a little bit interesting, but the style in which they're drawn is not interesting to say the least. Now, oftentimes backgrounds don't share visual resemblance with the character models, and this is largely because they're either drawn by a different team or they're put together using a different software or set of tools. Now, while this problem I'm about to bring up isn't a big deal in every cartoon, this can at times lead to some poor matching between the characters and the backgrounds. And thankfully, this was not extremely noticeable in Infinity Train, but the series is still a victim of the primary reason for why poor matchings end up happening, which is that the backgrounds have a generic paint job with very little stylization that falls in line with the art style of the series. Now, this won't be too distracting simply because Infinity Train doesn't seem to have an extremely digitalized texture present in the models, but whenever I try to peek at the environment they're surrounded by, I'm always like, wow, this looks kind of bland, which is tragic because some of the locations are conceptually interesting and lend themselves opportunities for gripping atmosphere, but they're not drawn or painted remarkably. I can only really recall several instances outside the moving train and also the first scene of the very first episode where the scenery did manage to get my attention, but most of the time I didn't really get much out of the backgrounds. It's not even that they're badly drawn, but they're not great either. Compare this with something like Over the Garden Wall, where the color design, the gradients, and the very personality of the scenery are much better handled and taken care of, and the results speak for themselves. As far as the story goes, it did get my attention from the get-go, but one thing that almost ruined the show for me was the pacing, because it was not good, especially in the first two episodes. It was extremely fast, and I was really disappointed by how they handled Tulip's introduction to the train in such a rapid manner. I would have liked it more if they had approached it slowly, allowing me to sink in the new environment that the main character had put herself in, but everything felt too fast. I appreciate the impatience and frustration on the part of Tulip, which allowed for some intense dialogue, but even then, this wouldn't necessarily be unreachable if it had a slower pace. I also kind of hated the rushed bond between Tulip and One-One, where she suddenly declared that she was good friends with him by the end of the second episode. I understand why she would feel guilty for heartlessly letting that cat take him, but I also think this was a bit of a stretch for her to be strongly attached to him, to the point where she would gush about how they're good friends. They barely knew each other, and by that point, we as audience members didn't see much of their relationship being fleshed out. Another thing I want to bring up is the dialogue, which varies in quality depending on the scene. Now, initially I wasn't impressed with the quality of the writing of some of the lines, particularly the ones that had a bit of a light-hearted and comedic tone. It did not work for me, but that was of course until they introduced Atticus, who was thankfully an amusing fellow. Sad One had its fair share of funny lines, but Glad One was mostly boring. So once the band was fully formed, the character interactions became a lot more pleasant. The rest of the characters did overall a good job offering some nice dialogue exchanges, my favorite ones being the Shadow Cop, drops who were surprisingly very entertaining to listen. However, I want to specifically talk about Tulip because she is both responsible for some of the best moments of dialogue and some of the worst. She's at her best when she's bitter and frustrated. Pretty much every scene where she expresses this emotion feel human and powerful, with maybe the best example being after she revisited memories from her past and she was completely done not giving a fuck about the train or the mystery number on her palm. But her worst moments are when she's feeling the exact opposite emotion. Whenever she's feeling in control of her struggles, is willing to open herself up, or has a moment of development, it's like she becomes an expert on emotional expression and stability. It's almost like the words that are coming out of her mouth are actually coming from the writer and not herself, because there's no way she would become this mature, not only at the age she's in, but also at this very short time frame that the series is taking place. But fuck, whatever, to give credit where credit is due, I enjoyed the emotional struggle that Tulip faced all throughout the series. I think I would have gotten tired of her arc if it had gone for longer than it did, which is one of the reasons why I'm glad this became a miniseries. I was compelled by the subject they addressed, although I will say that they did underexplore the concept of a long, endless moving train. This was the strongest gimmick that they had, but I didn't think it was taken advantage of as much as they could have. You could argue that it was because the series was short, and I guess I kind of agree, but I still think it's worth noting this. Overall, I would say this is a worthwhile series that might be engaging all throughout, although I should warn you that there are some breaks from the main storyline in favor of more self-contained stories. Not too much, and they're not even necessarily bad, although it can feel like they're padding a little bit, but don't worry, this isn't really a big deal, just a minor warning. I'd rather not give this a rating just to avoid outrages and disagreements. Nah, just kidding, it's a 7 out of 10.